What would you do if flashing red and blue lights suddenly filled your rearview mirror and you knew you did absolutely nothing wrong? Imagine this. It's a quiet night. You're driving home after a long day. The streets are calm. Your mind is on dinner, on family, on tomorrow's plans. Then sirens. You pull over, confused but calm. 2 police cars stop behind you. Then a third one arrives. Suddenly, what should have been a simple traffic stop turns into something far more intense. Step out of the vehicle. Where are you coming from? What are you doing in this neighborhood? The questions keep coming. The tone changes. The suspicion grows. You cooperate. You stay respectful. You answer everything. But somehow, that's not enough. They say you were swerving, even though you know you weren't. They ask to search your car without giving a clear reason. And when you politely ask about probable cause, the atmosphere shifts. Now you're not just a driver. You're suspicious. 3 patrol cars. Neighbors watching. Flashing lights turning a normal street into a public scene. Your heart starts pounding. Not because you're guilty, but because you realize something deeper is happening. You're being judged, not by your actions, but by perception. And here's the most powerful part. Everything changes in a single moment, not because you argue, not because you fight back, but because they discover who you really are. The same officers who were firm, skeptical, almost aggressive, suddenly become polite, respectful, apologetic. Why? What did they discover? And more importantly, why did that discovery change everything? Tonight's story isn't just about a traffic stop. It's about assumptions. It's about power. It's about how quickly treatment can shift when status enters the picture. And by the end of this video, you're going to ask yourself one serious question. If it hadn't been who he was, how would this story have ended? Stay with me until the end, because what happens next doesn't just shock the officers. It teaches a lesson about justice that none of them, and none of us, will ever forget. This isn't just a story. It's a moment that exposes something deeper. And trust me, you don't want to miss how it ends. Flashing red and blue lights exploded across the rearview mirror. In that single moment, an ordinary drive home turned into something no one would ever forget. It was 9:37 p.m. on a cool Thursday night. The kind of night where the air feels calm, where streetlights glow softly against the pavement, and the world seems to be slowing down after a long day. Maple Avenue was nearly empty, just a few scattered cars passing through the quiet neighborhood. A black sedan moved steadily down the road, perfectly centered in its lane. Inside, the driver adjusted the volume on the radio before turning it off completely. He preferred silence after long work days. It helped him think. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit, ties slightly loosened, glasses resting comfortably on his face. His posture was relaxed but alert. One hand rested lightly at the top of the steering wheel, the other near the gear shift. His mind was focused on simple things, dinner plans, an early morning meeting, whether he'd remembered to respond to an important email. Nothing about the drive felt unusual until the lights appeared. At first, he thought it was just another vehicle passing behind him. But then he noticed the unmistakable flash, red and blue, bouncing off storefront windows and reflecting sharply in his rearview mirror. He blinked. The siren chirped once. His stomach tightened. "Okay," he murmured quietly to himself. He checked his speed. 5 miles under the limit. He glanced at the road markings. Centered. Turn signals? He had used them. Still, the patrol car stayed directly behind him. Another short burst of the siren. There was no doubt now. They were pulling him over. He signaled calmly and eased the car toward the curb. His movements were smooth, deliberate. No sudden turns, no hesitation. He had nothing to hide. He'd done nothing wrong. As he brought the car to a complete stop, his heartbeat began to pick up, not out of guilt, but out of awareness. Traffic stops, no matter how routine, carried unpredictability. Before he could even place the car in park, another set of flashing lights appeared. A second patrol unit. The 2 police cars boxed him in, one directly behind, one angled slightly to the left. That seems excessive, he thought quietly. The street, once calm and peaceful, now felt exposed. The flashing lights painted nearby houses in chaotic colors. Curtains shifted. Porch lights flicked on. A few neighbors peeked outside. Inside the sedan, he rolled down his window, turned off the engine, and placed both hands clearly on the steering wheel at the 10-2 position. He waited. The first officer stepped out of his vehicle quickly, tall, broad-shouldered, one hand resting near his holster. The second officer exited more slowly, scanning the surroundings before focusing on the driver. The gravel crunched beneath their boots as they approached. The driver took a steady breath. The first officer stopped a few feet from the window. "Evening," the officer said, voice firm but not friendly. "Good evening, officer," the driver replied calmly. "License and registration." The tone wasn't conversational. It was clipped, direct. "Of course," the driver answered. He moved slowly, deliberately, narrating his actions. "My wallet is in my inside jacket pocket," he said clearly. "Registration is in the glove compartment." The second officer shifted slightly, watching closely. "Go ahead," the first officer replied. The driver retrieved his wallet carefully and handed over his license. Then he reached across and opened the glove compartment, removing the registration documents without fumbling. Everything was valid. Everything was clean. The officer glanced at the documents, then at the driver. "Do you know why we pulled you over?" The driver shook his head gently. "No, sir. You were swerving." The statement caught him off guard. "Swerving?" he repeated. "I'm not aware of that." "You crossed the line back there." "I don't believe I did," he said respectfully. "But if I made a mistake, I apologize." The second officer leaned closer to the car window, shining a flashlight briefly inside. Across the dashboard, the back seat, the passenger floorboard. "What are you doing in this area tonight?" the officer asked. "I'm heading home." "Where's home?" He gave his address calmly. The officers exchanged a brief glance. It was subtle but noticeable. "And where are you coming from?" "Work." "What kind of work?" There was a pause. "I'm in public service," he answered evenly. The officer's expression shifted slightly, skeptical. "What does that mean exactly?" The driver hesitated, not out of fear, but out of principle. The question didn't seem relevant to a traffic violation. "I prefer to keep that private unless it's necessary," he replied calmly. The air changed. The first officer straightened. "Step out of the vehicle." The words landed heavily. "Officer," the driver asked carefully, "may I ask why?" "Step out of the vehicle, sir." His pulse thudded in his ears now, but he didn't argue. He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly and stepped out, keeping his hands visible at all times. The night air felt colder outside the car. The flashing lights were brighter than before. Passing cars slowed, some nearly stopping to watch. "Stand right here," the officer instructed, guiding him toward the rear of the sedan. The second officer continued inspecting the vehicle with a flashlight. "Is there a problem?" the driver asked calmly. "Just routine," the officer replied. But there was nothing routine about two patrol cars, two officers, and the intensity in their voices. The driver stood quietly, hands loosely clasped in front of him. His thoughts raced, not with panic, but with awareness. He knew how quickly misunderstandings could escalate. He knew how important tone and body language were in moments like this. So he remained composed, respectful, still, but deep down, one question echoed louder than the sirens had moments before. Why does this feel like more than a simple traffic stop? And as neighbors continued watching from dimly lit porches, and as the officers circled his car like they were searching for something that wasn't there, the calm Thursday night had officially turned into something else entirely. Something tense, something uncertain, something that was only just beginning. The flashing lights continued to spin, casting long, restless shadows across the pavement. What had started as a routine stop was beginning to feel like something else entirely. The man stood near the rear of his car, the cool night air brushing against his face. He kept his posture relaxed, shoulders down, hands visible, movement slow. He had learned long ago that composure could prevent small situations from spiraling out of control. But the officer's energy had shifted. The second officer circled the sedan slowly, shining a flashlight through every window as if expecting something to jump out. He crouched briefly to peer under the car, then stood up again unsatisfied. "Where exactly did you say you're coming from?" the first officer asked again. From work, the man replied. What kind of work? The officer repeated, his tone sharper this time. I'm in public service. The officer gave a short, skeptical laugh. That's pretty vague. It's accurate. The man responded calmly. The first officer stepped closer. You got somewhere specific you need to be tonight? I'm heading home. Why are you driving through this neighborhood? The question lingered in the air. The man blinked once. Because it's on the way to my house. The officer tilted his head slightly, as if weighing the answer for hidden meaning. The second officer joined them again. You live around here? Yes. How long? Several years. The officers exchanged another look, subtle but heavy with implication. It was the kind of look that didn't require words. One officer stepped a bit closer, lowering his voice slightly. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. What kind of activity? The man asked calmly. Break-ins. Stolen vehicles. The implication was clear. And I matched the description? He asked evenly. The officer hesitated. You fit certain indicators. What indicators? Just answer the questions. The man felt the shift again, that tightening of tone, that hardening of posture. He knew the pattern. A broad accusation without specifics. A general statement designed to justify deeper probing. I've cooperated fully, he said respectfully. Is there something specific you're investigating? The first officer's jaw tightened slightly. Are you refusing to cooperate? I'm asking for clarification. The second officer stepped forward. Mind if we search your vehicle? The man paused. There it was, the turning point. Is there probable cause? He asked calmly. The words seemed to echo louder than they should have. The first officer straightened immediately. Excuse me? Is there probable cause to search my vehicle? The man repeated, steady and controlled. The second officer crossed his arms. If you don't have anything to hide, why not just let us take a look? The man met his gaze. Because I know my rights. Silence. The air thickened. One officer muttered under his breath, just loud enough to hear. He thinks he's clever. Another patrol car pulled up behind the first two, its lights flashing brightly. Now 3 vehicles lit up the quiet street, like a scene from a crime drama. Neighbors had stepped outside completely now. A woman stood with her arms crossed on her porch. A man leaned against a mailbox across the street. A teenager held up a phone, possibly recording. The man felt the weight of public scrutiny, but he refused to let embarrassment show on his face. The third officer approached. What's going on? Driver's being evasive. The first officer replied. I'm not being evasive, the man said calmly. I've answered every question. He's refusing a search. The third officer studied him carefully. Why refuse? Because I'd like to understand a reason for the search. The third officer nodded slowly, as if assessing the situation. You seem nervous, he observed. I was pulled over by 3 patrol cars, the man replied. That tend to get anyone's attention. The first officer stepped closer again. Have you been drinking tonight? No. Any drugs in the vehicle? No. Any weapons? No. Step over here, the officer ordered, guiding him toward the front of the patrol car. The man complied. Place your hands on the hood. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not in defiance, but in disbelief. Am I being detained? He asked calmly. Yes, the officer replied quickly. For what reason? Suspicion. Suspicion of what? The officer didn't answer directly. The third officer spoke instead. You're acting unusually defensive. I'm standing calmly and asking questions, the man replied. The second officer's tone grew sharper. Most people don't argue about a simple search. I'm not arguing, he said. I'm exercising my rights. That sentence seemed to irritate them more than anything else he had said. The first officer leaned closer. Listen, we're trying to do our job. You're making this harder than it needs to be. With respect, the man answered evenly. I'm not responsible for how you interpret my cooperation. The officers fell silent again. The tension was no longer subtle. It was visible in their posture, in the clipped tone of their words, in the way their hands hovered near their belts. The man could feel the shift, the moment where routine questioning had turned personal. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't aggressive. He was simply calm. And somehow, that calmness seemed to unsettle them more than anything else. The third officer finally spoke. "You fit the general description of someone we're looking for." "What is that description?" the man asked. "Male, driving a dark sedan." He looked back at his car. "That describes half the city." The first officer's patience appeared to thin. "You want to cooperate? Or do you want to make this a bigger issue?" The statement was less a question and more a warning. The flashing lights continued spinning, bathing the scene in red and blue. The man realized something important in that moment. This had stopped being about traffic. It had stopped being about suspicion. It had become about control. He took a slow breath. He understood exactly how delicate the situation had become. One wrong tone, one sudden movement, one misunderstood gesture, and things could escalate far beyond what anyone intended. So instead of raising his voice, instead of arguing, instead of reacting emotionally, he made a decision. Very slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket. Immediately, one officer stepped back sharply. "Hands where I can see them." The man froze, keeping his movement slow. "It's okay," he said calmly. "I'm reaching for identification." The officers stiffened, watching every movement. And in that split second, with 3 patrol cars flashing, neighbors watching, tension thick in the air, everything was about to change. The air felt electric. 3 patrol cars idled with their lights flashing, washing the street in waves of red and blue. Neighbors stood frozen on porches and sidewalks. A phone camera glowed from across the street. And in the middle of it all, the man stood still, his right hand slowly moving toward the inside pocket of his suit jacket. "Hands where I can see them," one officer barked again, his voice tighter than before. "My hands are visible," the man said calmly. "I'm reaching for identification." Slowly, the first officer warned. Every movement now carried weight. The smallest motion seemed amplified under the flashing lights. The man carefully pulled out a small black leather wallet, different from the one that held his driver's license. This one was slim, polished, official-looking. He opened it deliberately and held it forward. The nearest officer took it, cautious at first. His expression was firm, almost irritated, as he flipped it open. Then he froze. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sirens. The officer's eyes scanned the credential once. Then again, his posture changed almost instantly. The tension in his shoulders softened. His jaw unclenched. He glanced up at the man, then back down at the badge and identification card inside the leather case. "Where did you get this?" the second officer asked quickly, stepping closer. "It belongs to me," the man replied quietly. The first officer swallowed. "Sir, one moment." He walked briskly toward the other patrol cars, motioning the second and third officers to follow. The 3 huddled near the hood of the nearest cruiser, speaking in low, urgent whispers. The man remained standing where he was told, hands loosely at his sides. He didn't smile. He didn't look angry. He simply watched. Across the street, neighbors leaned in closer, sensing the shift in energy. The first officer spoke in a hushed tone. "It's real." "You sure?" the third officer asked. "Absolutely." The second officer shook his head slightly in disbelief. "You gotta be kidding me." Because a man they had surrounded, questioned, and nearly searched without clear cause was a federal judge, not a minor official, not a clerk, not someone loosely connected to the system. A United States District Court judge, a man who had presided over high-profile cases, including several involving law enforcement accountability and civil rights. The irony settled in quickly. The third officer exhaled sharply. "Does he seem angry?" "He seems calm," the first officer replied quietly. "That might be worse," the second muttered. For a few seconds, none of them moved. Then the first officer straightened his uniform and walked back toward a man, the credential wallet held carefully in both hands. "Sir," he began, and his voice was no longer sharp. It was respectful, almost cautious. "Your Honor, we apologize for the misunderstanding." The difference in tone was unmistakable. The man met his eyes calmly. "Misunderstanding?" "Yes, sir. We were conducting a routine investigation, and..." A routine investigation? The judge repeated gently. The officer hesitated. The judge continued, his voice steady but firm. 3 patrol cars. Accusations of swerving without citation. Questions unrelated to traffic. A request to search without probable cause. The officer lowered his gaze slightly. We were following procedure, sir. The judge studied him for a moment. Procedure, he said quietly. Is that what you call it? Behind him, the other 2 officers stood stiffly, their earlier confidence replaced with visible discomfort. The second officer cleared his throat. We didn't realize who you were. The judge's expression didn't change. That, he said calmly, is exactly the problem. Silence spread across the street. Even the hum of engines seemed quieter now. You treated me differently the moment you learned my title, the judge continued. Nothing about my behavior changed. Only your knowledge did. The officer said nothing. The flashing lights suddenly felt excessive, almost embarrassing. The judge glanced briefly at the houses lining the street. Several neighbors were still watching. One person lowered their phone slowly. If I had been anyone else, he said evenly, how would this have ended? The question lingered like smoke. The first officer swallowed. Sir, we were just trying to ensure public safety. And public safety is important, the judge replied. But so are rights. He took a step closer, not aggressively, but deliberately. I asked about probable cause. That should not escalate a situation. No, sir, the officer admitted quietly. I asked if I was being detained. That is a lawful question. Yes, sir. And I cooperated fully from the beginning. The officers nodded faintly. The judge's voice softened slightly, not in anger, but in disappointment. I carry credentials, he said. Most people do not. The meaning was unmistakable. The third officer shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, we sincerely apologize. The judge held his gaze for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. May I have my identification back? Of course, sir. The first officer handed it back carefully, almost reverently. The flashing lights were finally turned off. One by one, darkness returned to the street, broken only by the steady glow of street lamps. The judge slid the credential wallet back into his pocket and adjusted his jacket. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the first officer asked quietly, Is there anything we can do to make this right, sir? The judge paused before answering. Yes, he said calmly. The officer stiffened slightly. Reflect. The word landed heavier than any accusation could have. Consider what changed tonight, the judge continued. And why? No one responded. The lesson had already begun to sink in. The judge walked back to the sedan, opened the door, and paused before getting inside. He turned slightly. Professionalism, he said gently, should never depend on status. Then he entered the vehicle and closed the door. The engine started, without sirens, without drama, just the quiet hum of a car pulling away from a curb. As he drove off, the 3 officers remained standing under the fading glow of their own headlights. The scene that had once felt tense and controlled now felt humbling, because the man they had doubted, the man they had pressured, the man they had nearly searched without cause, was someone who understood the law better than they ever would. But more importantly, he was still just a citizen, and that realization would stay with them far longer than the flashing lights ever did. The street returned to silence, but the weight of what had just happened lingered long after the judge's car disappeared around the corner. The 3 officers stood beside their patrol vehicles, no longer speaking over one another, no longer commanding the scene. The flashing lights were off now. The night felt darker, quieter, almost reflective. For the first time since the stop began, there was no urgency, only thought. The third officer finally broke the silence. That could have gone very differently. No one disagreed. The first officer removed his cap and ran a hand through his hair. We followed protocol. Did we? The second officer asked quietly. That question hung heavier than any accusation, because deep down, each of them knew the truth. The stop had escalated not because of behavior, but because of perception, because of tone, because of assumptions. Back in his car, the judge drove slowly, his face calm but his mind active. He replayed every moment. The initial command to step out, the repeated questioning, the request to search without clear cause, the shift in attitude once his identity was revealed. He wasn't angry. He was disappointed. And disappointment, he knew, could be far more powerful than anger. When he reached home, he parked in his driveway and sat in silence for a moment before stepping out. The porch light flickered on automatically. Everything looked normal, peaceful, untouched by the chaos of the last 30 minutes. But something inside him had shifted. He wasn't thinking about revenge. He wasn't thinking about complaints. He was thinking about responsibility. Weeks passed. The incident didn't make the news. No viral videos surfaced. No internal investigations were launched. But the lesson was still alive. Because during a scheduled public forum on community policing, one that had already been planned long before the traffic stop, the judge found himself seated at the front of a packed courtroom. Officers filled several rows. Community members filled the rest. The topic of discussion, trust between citizens and law enforcement. When it was his turn to speak, the room grew quiet. He stood slowly, adjusted his glasses, and looked across the room, not at anyone specifically, but at everyone. "I want to talk about perception," he began calmly. No one knew he was about to speak from personal experience. "Perception," he continued, "can either protect justice or quietly erode it." Several officers shifted slightly in their seats. "Recently," he said carefully, "I experienced a traffic stop. Nothing dramatic. No shouting. No violence. Just questions." He paused. But what struck me wasn't what was said. It was what changed. The room remained silent. "I cooperated fully," he explained. "I answered every question. I remained calm. I asked about probable cause when a search was requested." A few officers in the audience exchanged subtle glances. "And then," he continued, "I presented identification that revealed my profession." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. The meaning was clear. The tone shifted. He said evenly. The posture shifted. The assumptions shifted. A quiet murmur moved through the room. I was treated differently, not because of my behavior, but because of my title. The officers from that night sat toward the back. None of them moved. The judge's voice remained calm, never accusatory. "This is not about embarrassment," he said. "It is not about punishment. It is about reflection." He stepped slightly away from the podium. "If I had not carried credentials," he continued, "what would have been different?" No one answered. "That question," he said softly, "matters more than any complaint ever could." The room felt heavy with thought. "Authority is necessary," he continued. "Law enforcement plays a critical role in maintaining safety. But authority must always walk beside fairness." He paused again. "Respect cannot be conditional." The words echoed quietly through the courtroom. "Professionalism cannot depend on status." The officers from that night listened without interruption. The judge concluded simply, "Justice does not begin in the courtroom. It begins on the street." When he sat down, there was no applause, no dramatic reaction, only silence. But it was the kind of silence that signals understanding. After the forum ended, something unexpected happened. The first officer from that night approached him privately. "Your Honor," he began quietly, "I believe I was one of the officers during that stop." The judge looked at him calmly. "I know." The officer swallowed. "I've thought about it every day since." The judge studied his face, not looking for guilt, but for sincerity. "I'm not proud of how it escalated," the officer admitted. "We let assumptions guide us." "That awareness," the judge replied gently, "is where change begins." The officer nodded slowly. "Why didn't you file a complaint?" The judge offered a small, thoughtful smile. "Because discipline teaches compliance," he said. "Reflection teaches growth." The officer lowered his eyes briefly. "I hope we earn the trust we're given," he said. "So do I," the judge answered. And that was it. No anger, no hostility, just accountability. Over time, the department implemented additional training sessions focused on communication during traffic stops. Emphasis was placed on tone, de-escalation, and understanding citizens' rights, especially when those rights were respectfully exercised. The incident never became public controversy, but it became something more important. a turning point. Because the lesson wasn't about discovering who someone really was. It was about realizing that who someone is should never change how they're treated in the first place. The flashing lights from that Thursday night were long gone, but the reflection they sparked continued to shine. And in the end, the most powerful part of the story wasn't that the man was a federal judge. It was that he chose principle over pride, education over retaliation, and accountability over revenge. Because true justice isn't about titles. It's about fairness, even when no one important is watching, especially then.